I'd like to thank the National Press Club for hosting this event, the folks at the Center for Immigration Studies and who helped set it up, particularly Cindy Owens and Brian Griffith. And I'd like to also thank my co-author of the original paper, wildlife biologist Wynne Staples. And by the way, Steve, if I run a little long, will you give me the hook?
Of course.
Us academics tend to run a little long. The environmental argument for reducing immigration into the United States is relatively straightforward. Immigration levels are at a historic high, and immigration is now the main driver of U.S. population growth. Population growth contributes significantly to many environmental problems within our borders, and also a growing population increases America's large environmental footprint beyond our borders and our disproportionate role in stressing global ecosystems. Continued U.S. population growth doesn't appear to be compatible with ecological sustainability, either nationally or globally. So environmentalists should support reducing current high levels of immigration into the United States. This conclusion rests on a straightforward commitment to mainstream environmentalism, easily confirmed empirical premises, and logic. Despite this, it's not the consensus position among American environmentalists. Some environmentalists support continued high levels of immigration. Most of us just don't want to talk about it. So strong is this aversion that groups such as the Sierra Club, which during the 1970s prominently featured a commitment to stabilizing U.S. population, they've just dropped domestic population growth as an issue. Several years ago, the group Zero Population Growth went so far as to change its name to Population Connection, or PC for short. I'm curious, how many of you have heard of the phrase zero population growth? Okay, that means something, right? How many of you, what does population connection mean? Anything? So they took this, terrific name, you couldn't buy such a great brand, and they just, changed it to something that's meaningless. In 2006, the United States passed the 300 million mark in population. That's 95 million more than were here for the first Earth Day in 1970, with little or no comment from environmentalists. In 2007, as Congress debated the first major overhaul of immigration policy in nearly 20 years, leaders from the principal environmental organizations remained resolutely silent about proposals that would have added hundreds of millions more Americans during the 21st century. Like immigration policy for the past 50 years, immigration policy for the next 50 looks likely to be set with no regard for its environmental consequences. And I think that's a bad thing. As a committed environmentalist, I'd like to see my government set immigration policy and all government policy within the context of a commitment to sustainability. I don't think the goals I share with my fellow environmentalists and with a large majority of my fellow citizens, goals like clean air and clean water, livable, uncrowded cities, sharing the land with flourishing populations of all our native wildlife species, I don't think these goals are compatible with continued population growth. It's time to rein in this growth or honestly renounce the hope of living sustainably here in the United States. Now in the paper, Wynne and I lay out this argument in some detail. Here I'd just like to hit a few main points and consider one or two of the more common objections to our argument. An obvious place to start is with the question, how much difference does immigration really make to American population growth? And the answer is, as Steve pointed out earlier, a lot. Now, this wasn't always necessarily the case. For much of the previous century, U.S. population growth was driven primarily by high native birth rates. So during the 1950s, for example, American women were having about 3.5 children per person. Immigration was low, and our population was rapidly increasing. By the 1970s, however, American women were having fewer children. In 1975, our replacement rate, fertility rate, stood at a lowest ever 1.7 children per person. And the United States was well positioned to transition from a growing to a stable population. Most other developed countries made that transition between 1970 and today. Countries like Germany, France, Japan, their populations have leveled off. It didn't happen here, however, because in 1965 and several times thereafter, Congress greatly increased immigration levels. Between 1965 and 1990, immigration averaged 1 million people annually, 5 times the average in the previous 4 decades. Since 1970, immigration has increased even more to approximately 1.5 million annually. That's the highest rate in American history. And our population has continued to increase rapidly. So in a sense, the American people decided to stabilize our population, but we were overruled by Congress. Today, immigration is clearly the main driver of U.S. population growth. In 2000, the U.S. Census Bureau released population projections for the year 2100 under different immigration scenarios. And just to give you three of their projections, under a zero immigration regime for the 21st century, our population does continue to grow throughout the 21st century. There's a lot of growth built into the system. So it might add maybe 90 to 100 million people by 2100. But under a higher projection, with immigration a little less than 1 million annually, we would instead add nearly 300 million people, according to the Census Bureau. So we would double our population in 2100. And under the high scenario, with over 2 million immigrants annually, our population will nearly triple, adding almost 600 million people for around 850 to 870 million people in 2100. So obviously then, according to the Census Bureau, immigration makes a huge difference. It really makes the main difference in future U.S. population numbers. When Congress sets immigration policy, it's essentially also setting a national population policy.